Hello everyone, and welcome to the History of the War in Ukraine channel. Today we're taking a comprehensive look at the evolution of the conflict, from its deep historical roots to the full-scale invasion that shocked the world. This is a complex story with many layers, and our goal is to provide a clear, factual timeline to help understand how we got here. To truly grasp the situation, we have to go back further than 2014. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia is centuries old, marked by periods of shared history, cultural ties, and also immense struggle. For much of its history, Ukraine fought for its sovereignty, culminating in its independence in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was a pivotal moment. For the first time in generations, Ukraine was a fully independent nation, free to choose its own path. However, this newfound independence also set the stage for future tensions. Russia, under its new leadership, viewed the breakup of the Soviet Union as a major geopolitical catastrophe and saw an independent, west-leaning Ukraine as a threat to its sphere of influence. The first major flashpoint in the 21st century was the Orange Revolution in 2004. After a fraudulent presidential election, massive peaceful protests erupted across the country. Ukrainians demanded a fair vote, and they got one. This event showed the world and Russia the strength of Ukrainian civil society and its desire for a democratic, European-style future. It was a clear rejection of Russian-style political control. Over the next decade, Ukraine navigated a difficult path, balancing its relationships between the West and Russia. Pro-European and pro-Russian political factions vied for power, creating a deeply divided political landscape. This tension exploded in late 2013 with the Euromaidan Revolution, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, when then-President Viktor Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, suddenly backed away from a major association agreement with the European Union. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets of Kiev. What began as peaceful pro-European protests turned violent after a brutal crackdown by state security forces. The protests grew, lasting for months, and ultimately led to Yanukovych fleeing the country in February 2014. It was a clear message. The Ukrainian people had chosen a European path. Russia's response was swift and aggressive. Almost immediately, unmarked Russian troops, the so-called Little Green Men, appeared in Crimea, a peninsula in southern Ukraine, with a large ethnic Russian population and home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet. They seized control of key government buildings and military bases. In March 2014, a hastily organized and internationally condemned referendum was held, and Russia formally annexed Crimea. This was the first forcible annexation of territory in Europe since World War II. The international community responded with sanctions, but it did little to deter Moscow. Simultaneously, a conflict ignited in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region. Armed groups, backed, supplied, and often led by Russia, declared so-called People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. They fought against the Ukrainian military, turning the region into a brutal war zone. Despite overwhelming evidence of Russian involvement, including troops, tanks, and advanced weaponry crossing the border, Moscow consistently denied its role, claiming it was a purely internal civil war. This hybrid war would grind on for 8 long years, claiming over 14,000 lives and displacing millions. During this time, diplomatic efforts like the Minsk agreements were made to find a peaceful solution, but they repeatedly failed, leading to a frozen conflict with daily ceasefire violations. All the while, Ukraine was undergoing a profound transformation. The country accelerated its reforms, strengthened its military with Western support, and deepened its ties with NATO and the EU. The desire to join these Western alliances became a cornerstone of its national security policy, a move that the Kremlin viewed as a direct threat. Russian leadership, particularly President Putin, became increasingly vocal, publishing essays denying Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation and painting a picture of NATO enlargement as an existential threat to Russia. The rhetoric grew more and more aggressive. In late 2021 and early 2022, the world watched with growing alarm as Russia began a massive military buildup along Ukraine's borders. Over 150,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, were positioned in Russia and Belarus, completely surrounding Ukraine on three sides. Diplomatic efforts went into overdrive, with Western leaders flying to Moscow in a desperate attempt to prevent a war. Russia issued a list of security demands, including a guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO. These demands were seen as ultimatums and were rejected by the West. Then, in the early hours of February 24, 2022, the world's worst fears were realized. President Putin appeared on television to announce a special military operation. Minutes later, explosions were heard across Ukraine. Russia launched a full-scale invasion from the north, east, and south. The initial plan was likely a blitzkrieg, aimed at capturing the capital, Kyiv, within days and installing a puppet government. Russian forces advanced towards Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Kherson. But the Ukrainian people and their armed forces mounted a ferocious resistance that surprised the world and Russia. The battle for Kyiv was a turning point. Despite being heavily outgunned, Ukrainian defenders, using their knowledge of the terrain and Western-supplied anti-tank weapons, managed to halt the Russian advance. They inflicted heavy losses on Russian columns, and by early April, Russia was forced to retreat from the areas around Kyiv and northern Ukraine. This was a major strategic failure for Moscow and a monumental victory for Ukraine. It proved that Ukraine would not be easily conquered. The world witnessed unimaginable brutality in the newly liberated towns like Bucha and Irpin, where evidence of mass killings and atrocities against civilians was uncovered, leading to accusations of war crimes. Following the retreat from the north, Russia refocused its efforts on the east and south. The war entered a new phase, a brutal war of attrition centered on the Donbas region and the southern coastline. The battle for Mariupol became a symbol of Ukrainian defiance. For weeks, a small group of defenders held out in the vast Azovstal steel plant, enduring a relentless siege before finally being ordered to surrender. The city was left in ruins. Throughout the summer and into the fall of 2022, the front lines became a grinding back and forth of artillery duels. Then, in late August and September, Ukraine launched two stunning counteroffensives. First, in the Kharkiv region, a surprise attack routed Russian forces, liberating thousands of square kilometers of territory in a matter of days. It was a brilliant military operation that showcased Ukraine's growing capabilities. Then in November, after a long and difficult campaign, Ukrainian forces liberated the city of Kherson, the only regional capital Russia had managed to capture since the full-scale invasion began. As we move forward, the conflict has settled into another grueling phase. Russia has mobilized hundreds of thousands of new troops, and the fighting continues to be incredibly intense, particularly around cities like Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Ukraine continues to receive significant military and financial aid from its Western partners, which has been crucial for its defense. The war has caused a massive humanitarian crisis, with millions of Ukrainians forced to flee their homes, and has had a profound impact on global food and energy security. The path forward remains uncertain. Ukraine is determined to liberate all of its occupied territories, including Crimea. Russia shows no sign of backing down. The human cost of this war is staggering, and its geopolitical consequences will be felt for decades to come. Understanding this timeline is essential to grasp the stakes of this conflict, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire world. Thank you for watching. This has been a brief overview of a very complex and ongoing event. We'll continue to cover developments as they happen. If you found this video informative, please consider liking and subscribing to History of the War in Ukraine for more in-depth analysis. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.